I'm truly glad you're here. Tonight, I'd like to take you somewhere unlike any other place on Earth. To a city that does not rest on land, but floats on memory, craft, and quiet hands. To Venice. But not the crowded postcard Venice. We're going deeper into the heart of the city, into its workshops and taverns, its foggy mornings and firelit nights, into the rhythm of life that once moved between stone and water, with quiet dignity and quiet joy. What you're about to hear is a story warm, rich, and real. A story of barrel makers and lace weavers, of weddings lit by torchlight, and storms weathered with steady hands. This is the Venice that lived not in paintings, but in people. Let the noise of the world fall away, and let this story slow and true, like a gondola in the still water, come gently to you. Stone and Water, a Venetian Life. Chapter 1. Bread, Salt, and Morning Fog. Venice did not wake with the sun. It woke with the sound of oars. Before dawn, long before the bells of San Marco rang, the lagoon was already alive. Fishermen pushed off into the mist, their boats slicing quietly through the still water. Bakers lit their ovens with salt-damp wood, and porters, wrapped in heavy cloaks, hauled crates of dried figs, glass, and cloth off barges that had drifted in from across the Adriatic. In a narrow call behind the Campo San Polo, a cooper named Lorenzo stirred from his bed. His house was small, wooden-beamed and damp in winter, but he owned it, a rare thing in Venice, where most paid rent to merchant families or to the church. He rose early, not out of habit, but necessity. Barrels were always needed, for salted sardines, for wine, for olive oil from Dalmatia. Without barrels, Venice could not live, not on its water, not on its trade. Lorenzo's father had been a cooper, and his grandfather before him. The tools had not changed in 3 generations. Draw knife, mallet, hoop driver. Nor had the work soaking staves in hot brine to bend the yoke, shaping each piece by hand until they fit so tightly that no glue was needed. Just wood, just skill, just time. And that was the rhythm of Venice. Slow, exacting, inherited. At midday, he would take his barrels to the Fondaco dei Tedeschi, where German merchants bargained in a dozen tongues, their coins heavy with northern silver. Then to the fish market near the Rialto Bridge, where voices rang like gulls and the smell of the sea never left the stones. And in the evening, if his hands weren't too tired, Lorenzo would sit on the steps of his workshop, eat bread with salted anchovies, and listen to water against the pilings, to children playing near the well, to the city breathing. Venice was made of stone and water, yes, but also of labor, of men and women who worked quietly, who passed on their crafts not in books, but in muscle and memory. And it was this labor, humble and steady, that held the floating city in place. The craftsman's rhythm. By the time the morning fog had lifted from the canals, the city had already been working for hours. Along the Fondamenta delle Zattere, the longshoremen unloaded salt from Servia and lumber from the mountains. Venice was always hungry for timber, not only for buildings, but for shipyards. The arsenal, the city's great pride, was the largest industrial complex in Europe, churning out galleys with almost military precision. 1 ship a day, they said, if the workers were well fed and the wind stayed calm. But Lorenzo was not part of that world. His was the world of fragile balance between trade and craft, tradition and time. He belonged to the Scuola, the Guild of Coopers. Each trade in Venice had its own Scuola organizations that were part union, part fraternity, part spiritual brotherhood. They protected quality, controlled prices, trained apprentices, and buried their own when needed. Once a week, the master coopers met by candlelight in a quiet room above a chapel, where they reviewed requests for apprenticeships and complaints about poor work. You could not simply become a cooper. You served a 7-year apprenticeship, paid for with long hours, sore fingers, and a promise to keep secrets. For instance, how to treat the staves so the barrel wouldn't leak even after a year at sea, or which oak to use for wine and which for olives. It was not written anywhere. It was passed from calloused hand to calloused hand, in murmured words over steaming pots of broth. or during long nights when barrels had to be ready by sunrise. Lorenzo remembered those nights. He had started at 12. At 14, he could already carve a clean joint. At 16, he broke a finger and kept working. By 22, he had made his first full set of barrels alone. His father had wept not loudly, but with his hand resting on Lorenzo's shoulder, just once. By late afternoon, the city changed pace. Merchants drifted into taverns to trade stories and settle debts. Boys ran errands with baskets of flour and wax-sealed letters. Women leaned from balconies, calling down for herbs from the street vendors. Lorenzo finished his work, wiped the shavings from his bench, and swept the floor. He stacked the barrels carefully, 3 for wine, 2 for salted eel, 1 bound for the island of Burano. Then he stepped outside, into the amber light. The canal was quiet now. A gondola drifted past, slow and low in the water. On a nearby step, a tailor stitched in the fading sun. From an open window, someone played a soft tune on a viol. A child laughed. Lorenzo sat down, pulled a cloth from his pocket, and unwrapped a piece of pecorino and flatbread. He didn't eat quickly. In Venice, nothing should be rushed, not even hunger. And as the bells of Santa Maria dei Frari began to toll the evening hour, he felt what all Venetians knew in their bones. You do not need wealth in Venice to feel rich. You only need work, the taste of salt on your tongue, and the city beneath your feet. Stone and water, a Venetian life. The weight of bread and linen. In Venice, the market was not only a place of trade, it was a ritual. At sunrise, the square near the Rialto Bridge filled with voices before it filled with light. Fishermen hauled in eels and red mullets still twitching in their baskets. Women from Giudecca laid out bundles of herbs and lacework. Bakers, their aprons dusted with flour, sold bread still warm from stone ovens. Lorenzo came early, as he did every Thursday. He did not come for fish or fruit, but for linen thick cloth, for barrel seals, and soft scraps for wrapping stoppers. He bought it from Chiara, a woman with sharp eyes and gentle fingers, who ran her late husband's stall with quiet dignity. Her lace was among the finest in Venice, hand-tied, never rushed, passed down from her mother's mother. "The same as last week?" she asked. "If it's dry?" Lorenzo answered, smiling faintly. She wrapped the linen and added a sliver of rosemary, a small gift, as was the tradition among vendors who respected their clients. Venice respected the slow kind of loyalty. Business was built on it, not clever words. Across the square, a group of apprentice boat builders hauled oars over their shoulders. They were boys, not yet 17, working under masters in the boatyards of the Arsenal, the largest naval complex in the world. Inside its gates, galleys were built by torchlight fast, narrow ships made for war and trade alike. But out here, in the soft morning sun, they were just boys, tossing crusts to pigeons and laughing at girls who pretended not to notice. In Venice, you learned early not only your craft, but your place. By 14, a baker's son knew the exact weight of a morning loaf. A mason's daughter could spot a weak corner in a brick arch. A lace maker's fingers moved like water, and every child knew to listen to the bells, not just for time, but for news, for danger, for death. By mid-morning, the market quieted. Lorenzo made his way along the Fondaco dei Turchi, watching traders in long robes unloading spices and silks from ships that had crossed the eastern seas. Venice was Christian, yes, but the lagoon had no walls. Men of many faiths lived here not always peacefully, but always under the same sky, the same salt wind. And everyone, Jew, Greek, Turk, Latin, paid the same tax at the port. That too was tradition. Back in his workshop, Lorenzo unfolded the linen. He cut it carefully, humming to himself. From the street came the soft clang of a blacksmith's hammer, the rhythm of a broom against stone, the cry of a fish seller echoing off water. Venice worked not in haste, but in harmony, and that, perhaps, was its greatest strength. A city not of kings and conquests, but of hands, thousands of them shaping barrels, baking loaves, threading lace, steering gondolas. A floating world, built not to rise, but never to sink. Evenings of oil and smoke. By the time the last barge left the docks and the sun folded itself into the western sea, Venice began to soften. The work of the day was done. Coopers, bakers, masons, fishmongers all retreated from their benches and barrels, leaving behind only wood shavings, flour, or the glistening scales of fish. Lorenzo closed the shutters of his shop, not to keep out the world, but to keep in the warmth. He lit a simple oil lamp, olive oil, thick and golden, and its soft flame danced on the tools hung along the wall, like quiet, loyal friends. There was no rush now, no more trade. The city was breathing out. He walked the few streets toward Campo San Giacomo, where a small tavern sat under sloping beams and faded red paint. It wasn't a place of luxury, no silks, no nobles, but it was his place. Inside, men gathered not to boast, but to rest. There were long wooden tables, always sticky with wine, and benches worn smooth by generations of tired legs. The air smelled of roast onions, dried anchovies, and smoke. At the far end, a man with white hair played a small mandolin, his fingers barely moving, as if the instrument knew the song better than he did. Lorenzo took his usual seat, nodded to the tavern keeper, and soon a ceramic cup of light red wine appeared beside a bowl of polenta with stewed beans. Nothing grand, just enough to fill the belly and warm the chest. Around him, voices drifted like slow-moving boats. The barrel hoops were splitting in the damp air. The fish prices had dropped again. The baker's daughter was to be married. The council had raised the salt tax again. Of course, no one shouted, no one argued. There was no energy left for that, only the low, steady rhythm of men who had worked with their hands all day and now needed only warmth, wine, and the sound of someone else breathing beside them. Outside, the lamps along the canals flickered to life one by one, their orange glow reflecting on the black water like stars that had fallen to earth. Women pulled in laundry before the dew could settle. Children curled against their mothers on worn straw mats. From an open window above the tavern, a slow hymn drifted down, someone reciting the Ave Maria, voice fragile, half prayer, half lullaby. And in the narrow streets, water touched stone again and again, as it had for centuries. When Lorenzo stepped outside, the city was almost silent. He walked slowly, hands in his coat, past bridges he could cross with his eyes closed. There were over 400 bridges in Venice, he once heard. He didn't know the number, he only knew which ones creaked, which ones held puddles, and which ones caught the moonlight just right. Back at his door, he paused. A gondola passed nearby, the oar slicing the surface like a whisper. He didn't need anything more from the night. He had worked, eaten, shared silence. In Venice, that was wealth. He stepped inside and left the city to sleep. Outside, the lamps along the canals flickered to life one by one, their orange glow reflecting on the black water like stars that had fallen to earth. Women pulled in laundry before the dew could settle. Children curled against their mothers on worn straw mats. From an open window above the tavern, a slow hymn drifted down, someone reciting the Ave Maria, voice fragile, half prayer, half lullaby. And in the narrow streets, water touched stone again and again, as it had for centuries. When Lorenzo stepped outside, the city was almost silent. He walked slowly, hands in his coat, past bridges he could cross with his eyes closed. There were over 400 bridges in Venice, he once heard. He didn't know the number, he only knew which ones creaked, which ones held puddles, and which ones caught the moonlight just right. Back at his door, he paused. A gondola passed nearby, the oar slicing the surface like a whisper. He didn't need anything more from the night. He had worked, eaten, shared silence. In Venice, that was wealth. He stepped inside and left the city to sleep. A day without work. Sunday in Venice did not begin with the sound of tools, it began with bells. The great bronze voice of San Marco rang first, deep and solemn. Then the smaller churches answered Santa Maria Formosa, San Polo, San Barnaba, until the whole city hummed with quiet invitation. Lorenzo rose with the sound, slowly, without urgency. His hands were still sore from the week's labor, but he welcomed the ache. It reminded him of the barrels he'd finished, the ones now waiting on barges to be carried eastward toward Corfu or Ragusa. He washed at the basin with cold water and dressed simply a clean linen shirt. a vest that had once belonged to his father, boots worn smooth at the heel. Outside, the streets were calmer than usual. The stone underfoot was dry, the canals still, as if the lagoon itself had paused to listen. The air smelled of salt and warm bread. From windows came the sound of mothers scolding children to finish tying their shoes. He crossed 3 bridges on the way to church, passing neighbors who nodded in silence. This was not a morning for loud greetings. This was a morning of order, a moment when the city remembered that time flowed not only in tides, but in tradition. At Santa Maria Gloriosa dei Frari, the choir had already begun. The church was vast, built in Gothic stone and shadow. Light poured through tall windows, dust swirling like incense in its beams. The priest's voice echoed gently under the vaulted roof. Speaking Latin words Lorenzo did not understand fully, but he didn't need to. He stood near the back, like he always did, hands folded in front of him. He didn't pray for fortune or health. He prayed quietly for steadiness, for the city to hold, for his tools to last, for peace in the night. When the service ended, no one rushed out. People spoke in soft tones, moved slowly, some remaining behind to light candles for relatives lost to illness or sea. After church came the true feast, not of food, but of slowness. Lorenzo walked along the Zattere promenade, where families strolled beside the water. Children chased each other between mooring posts. A young woman played with a dog on a length of rope. Musicians stood in the shade, plucking soft notes from vials and lutes. An old man sold warm chestnuts from a wooden cart. The city had taken off its working clothes and put on a softer skin. Lorenzo bought a handful of the chestnuts, ate them slowly on a bench facing the sea. Beside him sat a seamstress with her aging mother, both sharing a small pouch of raisins. No one spoke. They didn't need to. Sometimes, the best kind of peace is the one shared in silence. Later, he returned home to cook. Nothing elaborate: chickpeas, crushed garlic, black pepper, and a piece of salted pork boiled slowly in a clay pot. He'd eaten this meal since childhood, and it always tasted of memory, of simpler days, of his mother's hands, of winter evenings wrapped in wool. He ate by the window, watching the light shift across the canal, and thought of nothing. Not work, not taxes, not news from Rome or Constantinople. Just the meal, the stillness, the sound of pigeons flapping on a nearby roof. And when night came, as it always did, he lit his lamp again. And again, Venice went to sleep not like other cities, behind thick doors and locked gates, but gently, as if the water itself whispered to every wall, "Rest now, the work will wait." The measure of the hand. Wednesdays were for the guild, not for selling, not for hammering wood or lifting barrels, but for judgment. And in Venice, where craft was the city's backbone, judgment was never taken lightly. Lorenzo arrived at the Scuola dei Botai, the house of the Coopers, just before the second bell. The building was modest, hidden behind the Campo Santa Maria Mater Domini, with a simple carved door and iron lanterns that had burned for nearly a century. Inside, the air was cool, scented faintly of beeswax, sawdust, and oil. At the long central table sat the elder master's 5 men, each with at least 20 years of labor behind their hands. Their robes were dark wool, trimmed in gold thread, worn not for vanity but tradition. In Venice, symbols mattered: the robe, the seal, the order of speaking. These were the threads that held centuries together. Today, a young apprentice named Marco would present his test barrel, a rite of passage marking the end of his 7th year. He entered nervously, carrying the finished cask like a sacred object. It was well-shaped, polished, its iron hoops perfectly flush. He had burned his initials into the base, small, neat, proud. The oldest master, Signor Bellanti, stood and began the examination. First, he rolled the barrel, smooth, no wobble. Then, he tapped it once with his knuckle, once with a mallet. The sound rang true. He lifted it, tilted it, ran his hand along the grain. Silence. The young man stood motionless. Lorenzo watched from his usual place near the wall, arms folded. Finally, Bellanti nodded. "It holds," he said, and then more softly, "and it will last." That was enough. Marco smiled, barely, and the room relaxed. The masters signed a parchment, pressing their seals into warm wax. Marco was now a full cooper, entitled to take on apprentices, sell under his own name, and vote in the matters of the scuola. No celebration followed, no clapping. In Venice, pride was always worn quietly like a good coat, useful, not flashy. Afterward, the members remained to speak. They discussed quotas, the coming inspection from the Republic's trade magistrate, and the news from Chioggia, a rival town where barrels had arrived leaking. One master muttered that their staves were cut too green. Another nodded gravely. Lorenzo listened, but said little. He spoke only when needed, a habit born not from shyness, but from respect. In Venice, talk had value only when it was weighed with care. By early afternoon, the meeting was done. The men filed out into the light, robes tucked beneath their arms, stepping back into the city like water returning to its channel. Lorenzo returned to his workshop slowly, passing by the leatherworkers' stalls, the potters laying tiles, the stonemasons smoothing fresh mortar. Each guild had its scuola, each had its pride, and all of them, from weavers to goldsmiths, kept Venice afloat not by miracle, but by consistency. He paused at the edge of a canal and looked at his hands. They were not young. The skin was rough, the nails dark. A small scar crossed his thumb where a chisel had slipped years ago. But the hand still worked, still shaped, still carried memory. And in a city like Venice, that was all that mattered. Threads beneath the stone. Venice was a city of stone, but it was held together by thread. Behind every cooper's barrel, every merchant's contract, every carved window, there was a hand that stitched, scrubbed, mended, and prepared. Women's work, mostly unseen, but never unneeded. In a narrow courtyard off the Campo Santa Ternita, the sound of looms never stopped, not even during rain. The women of the Tessatrici, the weavers' quarter, worked with window shutters open for light and breeze, their fingers dancing across wooden frames faster than the eye could follow. Among them was Lucietta, a widow with 2 daughters, and a voice that always hummed while she worked. She wove linen for underclothes, hemp for sailcloth, wool for cloaks, and in the evenings, if her hands still had strength lace for noblewomen, she did not complain. In Venice, a working woman was not a rarity. She was a pillar. Lorenzo knew Lucietta well. He often bought sail covers from her, strong enough to shield barrels during shipment. Her cloth was tight, the stitching even. He respected her eye for detail and the way she never haggled. Her prices were fair, because her time had value. Like most working women in Venice, Lucietta belonged to a household guild, a quiet, all-female counterpart to the trade school. They supported each other with tools, coin, food, and protection. If a husband died at sea, it was these women who brought bread. If a child fell ill, it was they who sat by the bed and boiled herbs. No records, no seals, no velvet robes, just community. Across the canal, in the parish of San Cassiano, lived Giovanna, a laundress. She rose before the fishermen, washed linens in canal water with ash and soapwort, and dried them on ropes above the street. Her back hurt, her hands were raw, but the convent nearby paid her on time, and she always made a little extra by selling lavender sachets sewn into cloth scraps for noble women's drawers. She had never left Venice, never ridden in a gondola, never touched silk. But she could fold a shirt tighter than any maid in the city, and she could listen, really listen, when an old widow needed to talk. In this way, Giovanna was indispensable, though her name was never in records. Venice gave its women no voice in politics, no seats in councils, but in truth, the city leaned on them, on those who kept the bread rising, the cloth woven, the children fed, the walls scrubbed with vinegar when the fever came. And the men, though they rarely said it aloud, knew this. Even Lorenzo, who rarely shared his thoughts, once told a friend at the tavern, "If the sea ever swallows Venice, it won't be the stones that hold. It'll be what the women have stitched between them." That evening, as he passed through Calle delle Donzelle, the narrow alley of the weavers, Lorenzo tipped his head to Lucietta and her daughters. They sat under a small lantern, threading new patterns onto a stretched frame. "Buonasera," he said. "Buonasera, Maestro Lorenzo," Lucietta replied. They did not need to say more. The respect was there, not loud, but constant. Like the work of women in Venice, soft, unseen, and utterly essential. Threads beneath the stone. Venice was a city of stone, but it was held together by thread. Behind every cooper's barrel, every merchant's contract, every carved window, there was a hand that stitched, scrubbed, mended, and prepared. Women's work, mostly unseen, but never unneeded. In a narrow courtyard off the Campo Santa Ternida, the sound of looms never stopped, not even during rain. The women of the Tessatrici, the weavers' quarter, worked with window shutters open for light and breeze, their fingers dancing across wooden frames faster than the eye could follow. Among them was Lucietta, a widow with 2 daughters, and a voice that always hummed while she worked. She wove linen for underclothes, hemp for sailcloth, wool for cloaks, and in the evenings, if her hands still had strength, lace for noblewomen. She did not complain. In Venice, a working woman was not a rarity. She was a pillar. Lorenzo knew Lucietta well. He often bought sail covers from her, strong enough to shield barrels during shipment. Her cloth was tight, the stitching even. He respected her eye for detail and the way she never haggled. Her prices were fair, because her time had value. Like most working women in Venice, Lucietta belonged to a household guild, a quiet, all-female counterpart to the trade school. They supported each other with tools, coin, food, and protection. If a husband died at sea, it was these women who brought bread. If a child fell ill, it was they who sat by the bed and boiled herbs. No records, no seals, no velvet robes, just community. Across the canal, in the parish of San Cassiano, lived Giovanna, a laundress. She rose before the fishermen, washed linens in canal water with ash and soapwort, and dried them on ropes above the street. Her back hurt, her hands were raw, but the convent nearby paid her on time, and she always made a little extra by selling lavender sachets sewn into cloth scraps for noble women's drawers. She had never left Venice, never ridden in a gondola, never touched silk. But she could fold a shirt tighter than any maid in the city, and she could listen, really listen, when an old widow needed to talk. In this way, Giovanna was indispensable, though her name was never in records. Venice gave its women no voice in politics, no seats in councils, but in truth, the city leaned on them, on those who kept the bread rising, the cloth woven, the children fed, the walls scrubbed with vinegar when the fever came. And the men, though they rarely said it aloud, knew this. Even Lorenzo, who rarely shared his thoughts, once told a friend at the tavern, "If the sea ever swallows Venice, it won't be the stones that hold. It'll be what the women have stitched between them." That evening, as he passed through Calle delle Donzelle, the narrow alley of the weavers, Lorenzo tipped his head to Lucietta and her daughters. They sat under a small lantern, threading new patterns onto a stretched frame. "Buonasera," he said. "Buonasera, Maestro Lorenzo," Lucietta replied. They did not need to say more. The respect was there, not loud, but constant. Like the work of women in Venice, soft, unseen, and utterly essential. Seasons without land. Venice had no fields to watch ripen, no hills to shade with snow, but it knew the seasons all the same. Spring arrived with the scent of wet stone and green garlic. Boats brought baskets of peas and bitter herbs. Gondoliers shed their heavy cloaks. And the wood of the buildings, still swollen from winter damp, began to creak like waking bones. In Lorenzo's workshop, barrels dried faster, and glue set quicker. The breeze that swept in from the lagoon was no longer biting it, carried the smell of seaweed, warmed by the sun, and the laughter of children skipping stones between moorings. Summer, though beautiful, was slow. The air grew heavy. The canals, darker and more fragrant, moved lazily. Traders from the Levant arrived with spices and sweat-soaked brows. The campi, city squares, filled with barefoot boys chasing dogs, and women sat under linen canopies, fanning their faces with folded scraps of lace. Lorenzo learned long ago not to fight the heat. In July, he worked early, then paused for hours at midday, when the sun pressed down on the tiled roofs like a blacksmith's hammer. The barrels, even half-made, smelled sweet in the heat resin and pine. He took comfort in the slow rhythm of summer. A little work, a little wine, a long breath at sunset. But autumn was his season. The light shifted, it became amber, softer, thicker. The bells rang lower, the water darker. Fish grew fatter, and the bakers filled the streets with rosemary bread and chestnut pies. This was the season of maintenance, when boats were hauled for repair, when rope was inspected for rot, when the cooper's work returned in full force. Every fisherman needed new barrels. Every wine cellar knocked on Lorenzo's door, and he, in turn, welcomed the busyness. It reminded him of purpose. He loved the sound of oak staves fitting together, the clack of hammer on hoop, the comfort of work returning like the tide. Then came winter, quiet as breath. The fog arrived first, rolling in from the sea, heavy and silver. It swallowed bridges, blurred towers, turned lanterns into floating moons. Some days, the city disappeared completely. On those mornings, Lorenzo worked by lamplight. He dressed in wool, soaked his hands in warm vinegar to keep them nimble. Trade slowed, voices lowered. Even the pigeons seemed to land more gently. But there was beauty in winter, in the way silence filled the alleys, in the steam rising from pots of beans and salt pork, in the thick cloth that Lucietta wove to line children's coats, in the echo of footsteps across the frozen planks of the Rialto Bridge. Winter reminded Venice that it was not invincible, but enduring. The water rose sometimes too high, flooding floors and markets, but the people simply lifted their crates, rolled up their trousers, and waited. Venice had always floated. It would float still. Lorenzo kept a wooden tally stick near his door, one notch for every year of labor. The wood was worn smooth, the marks uneven, but each cut marked a full cycle of seasons, a full rhythm of tides and tools. And when he held it in his hand on winter nights, he did not count wealth or barrels. He counted time well spent. In Venice, the seasons didn't pass. They folded like cloth, like dough, like song. And through it all, the city endured not by resisting the water, but by listening to it. The weight of silence. There came a time in every craftsman's life when the tools no longer fit his grip, not because they changed, but because his hands had. Lorenzo began to feel it in winter, a deeper ache in his thumb joint, a slight tremble in his wrist when he lifted the mallet. It was not pain. It was weight, not of injury, but of years. In Venice, no one retired. The word didn't exist. Instead, a man stepped back, like a tide drawing out, leaving behind smooth stone and useful shells. And when that time came, he was not forgotten. He became a voice in the workshop, a slow-moving presence at the edge of the bench, watching, correcting, remembering. Lorenzo took on an apprentice that spring, Tommaso, the son of a rope maker from Cannareggio. The boy was tall, eager, with a nervousness that made him careful, which was better than boldness. Lorenzo did not praise him. Not yet. He watched first, corrected quietly. Let the wood do the teaching. Let the stave show you where it bends, he said one morning, handing the boy a freshly soaked board. Tommaso bent over it, eyes narrowed, sweat already on his brow. The workshop was warm, the shavings dry and curled around their boots like golden shells. Lorenzo stood beside him, arms folded. He remembered when he had first held that same stave, under his own father's gaze. The circle closed slowly like the rim of a barrel, built one curve at a time. That season, Lorenzo worked less. He spent more time sharpening tools, writing notes, polishing old handles with oil-soaked cloth. He kept a small ledger not for coin, but for lessons. Which woods bent best in damp air, how long to soak staves in salt water, which customers always paid late. Tommaso didn't know about the ledger. Not yet. It would be his gift when the time was right. On Sundays, Lorenzo no longer walked to the Rialto. His legs grew stiff, and he preferred the quiet of the Campo San Giacomo, where older men gathered in the sun, drinking thin wine and watching the canal move by. They did not speak much. There was no need. They had all given their years to the city, to oars, to tiles, to glass, to flour, to rope, to wood. Now they gave their silence. And the city, soft as tide, gave them space. One afternoon, Tommaso split a hoop. The sound echoed sharply. He froze, color rushing from his face. Lorenzo looked up from his bench, walked over, and ran his hand along the cracked iron. He said nothing, just nodded, handed the boy another piece, and stood beside him. Together, they fitted the next hoop, and the next, until the cask took shape again. Not perfect, but solid. That evening, Lorenzo sat alone and lit a small lamp. He took out the ledger. Slowly, with effort, he wrote one line. The boy listens. He learns faster than I did. Then he closed the book, blew out the flame, and listened to the water outside, to footsteps fading down the call, to a gondola passing in the dark. He did not fear age. He feared only leaving nothing behind. But that fear now had passed. The tools were in good hands, and the city, as always, would float on. Bread, wine, and bells. There was a wedding on Campo dei Mori, and the whole quarter felt it coming days before the bells rang. In Venice, a wedding was never just the joining of two people. It was a weaving of families, of neighbors, of streets that leaned toward each other over the water like curious ants. It was joy shared not in silk and silver, but in bread, fire, music, and laughter. The bride, Maria, was the daughter of a lace maker. Her fingers had tied over 100 wedding veils for other girls. Now she wore one of her own. The groom, Piero, was a shipbuilder's apprentice, broad-shouldered, always with sawdust in his cuffs, and a smile that started at the eyes. Lorenzo knew both families. He had made barrels for Maria's uncle, a vinegar seller, and once helped Piero carry a mast beam across a flooded courtyard. So when the call went out for food, cloth, tables, firewood, and music, Lorenzo joined as all good Venetians did. Not as a guest, but as a participant. The morning of the wedding, the canal beside the Campo shimmered in early light. Banners hung from balconies. A row of empty barrels had been laid sideways and covered in linen benches for the old and the weary. Women brought pots of braised beans with rosemary, baskets of anchovy-filled fritters, and bowls of marinated artichokes. Wine was poured not in glasses, but in ceramic mugs and tin cups passed from hand to hand, no two alike. There were no gold rings exchanged, no procession with horses. Venice had no room for such things. Instead, there were 3 rings of fire, lit on floating rafts in the canal by the firekeepers, small torches to bless the union, each flame tied to a vow, faith, labor, and endurance. Lorenzo sat on a barrel near the outer edge of the square. Tommaso was beside him, hands still dusty from morning work. Lucietta was braiding herbs into the table centerpieces. Children raced between flagstones. An old mandolin player tuned his strings slowly, his eyes closed, listening for the note that would begin the feast. And then silence. Maria stepped into the square, dressed in cream linen with a blue sash, the same color as the lagoon at dusk. Her veil moved with the wind. She did not smile widely, but her eyes were steady, and that was enough. The priest said only a few words, nothing about kingdoms or obedience, just this: may your house be like Venice, built on water, but strong in heart. Afterward, the celebration flowed like wine poured too quickly, loud, messy, joyful. The food came in waves. Songs followed stories. Old men sang sea shanties. Young boys banged pots in rhythm. Maria's veil was taken gently and placed over the lap of her mother, the sign that one family became 2. Piero kissed his bride not on a balcony, but beside a barrel of olives, while a child tugged at his sleeve, asking for a second helping of bread. As the sun dropped behind the rooftops, the floating torches still burned. Reflected in the water, they seemed like stars that had dropped to earth, bobbing softly in the rhythm of the tide. The music slowed. Women wrapped leftovers in cloth. Someone passed around a bottle of fig grappa. And for one perfect hour, the Campo was not part of a republic, not part of trade, not even part of history. It was just a neighborhood, full of people who worked, who aged, who married, who sang. Lorenzo leaned back against the stone wall, watching the bride and groom laugh together near the water. His knees ached, his hands were tired, but his chest was light. He did not need his own celebration. He had this one, and the quiet truth that his work, his food, His fire, his hands had helped make it happen. In Venice, no wedding belonged to one couple. It belonged to everyone who built the table. And that, more than any ring or robe, was the real vow. When the water rises, the storm came just after All Saints' Day. First, the wind arrived not loud, but strange, bending the clotheslines in odd directions, rattling shutters long before the rain began. In Venice, people knew the signs: the color of the water, the pitch of the gulls, the way the fog settled low, hugging the foundations as if the sea itself were remembering something old. By nightfall, the first waves had rolled over the paving stones of the Riva degli Schiavoni. The bells of San Marco rang not in alarm, but in warning, 3 low tones, then silence. A sound that meant acqua alta was coming. High water. Not a catastrophe. Not yet, but the kind of flooding that didn't ask permission. Lorenzo had seen many such nights in his life, but never without a small flicker of worry. Not for himself, he lived above the shop, his tools safe on wooden racks, but for the young, for the old, for the quiet corners of Venice that didn't drain as quickly as the rest. He lit a small lantern, wrapped his boots in oiled cloth, and stepped outside. The call was already slick. Water pushed against doorsteps, licking the wood like a curious cat. From an open window above, a woman shouted for her children to bring up the buckets. On the next bridge, a boy tied a gondola tighter to its mooring pole, his movements practiced and sure. Everyone knew what to do. There was no panic in Venice during Acqua Alta, only motion. Lorenzo joined the others near the Campo Santa Margherita, where barrels were rolled out and flipped to form temporary walkways. Shops had iron hooks on their doors to hang goods above the flood. Taverns moved tables up on crates. Bakers tied sacks of flour with ropes and lifted them onto shelves. It was like the city had rehearsed. And in truth it had, for centuries. He helped an elderly fish seller carry a basket of salted cod up 3 steps to safety, helped 2 boys wedge wood into a drainage grate. At every corner, someone else was already working, quiet hands, tired faces, steady hearts. It was not heroism. It was habit. And in Venice, habit was often stronger than fear. By midnight, the water was knee-deep in the lower quarters. Gondolas creaked against stone. Firelight flickered in windows, distorted by rising reflections. Somewhere near the arsenal, a glassblower's chimney sent one last plume of smoke into the night sky, a signal that even flame was holding its breath. Inside his shop, Lorenzo placed his tallest stool near the door, set his boots to dry, and sat with a blanket across his lap. He lit a small oil lamp and opened his ledger not to write, but simply to hold it. Sometimes, the weight of old words was enough to keep a man grounded. Outside, the water moved like a slow thought. A gondola floated past, with no one inside, ropes cut loose by the tide. A firekeeper waded through the flooded square with a torch above his head, the flame reflecting twice, in the water below and in the windows above. Lucietta appeared, cloak soaked, holding a bundle of cloth high against her chest. The weavings were drying, she said. They would have spoiled. Lorenzo took them from her hands and laid them gently on his highest shelf. No more words were needed. Only action. Only respect. They sat in silence a while, each watching the water climb one more step. And then, as if the sea had grown tired of its own mischief, the current slowed. The rain eased. The wind shifted. By morning, the bells rang again slowly, steadily. The water began to recede, pulled back into the lagoon as if it had only come to remind the city of something old, that beauty is always borrowed and must be respected. Children appeared first, bare-legged, splashing through puddles, then dogs, then gondoliers, checking their ropes. The barrels were rolled back inside. Brooms emerged, like soldiers after battle. Lorenzo stepped into the street and saw his reflection in the puddle, older, yes, but clear. He knelt, picked up a fallen piece of rope, and smiled faintly. Nothing had broken. Bogdan, 11.05, 2025, 15:27. Nothing had drowned. Only another page written not with ink, but with salt strength, and silence. In Venice, you never fought the water. You prepared. You endured. You helped. And when the sea rose, you stood together. Not because you were strong, but because you belonged. What remains? Years passed, as they always did, slowly at first, then all at once. The barrels still stood in Lorenzo's shop. The tools were still sharp. The wood still stacked neatly in corners. But it was Tommaso's hands now that shaped the staves. Tommaso's voice that answered the knock at the door. Tommaso's calm that kept the rhythm of the place steady. Lorenzo had become, in the best way, part of the furniture. A presence. A memory made flesh. He no longer worked the wood, but he still arrived at dawn, wrapped in a thick scarf, and sat in the corner with warm tea and warm eyes. He watched, listened, answered when asked. And sometimes, not often, he told stories. Not grand ones, no wars or love affairs or travels to Constantinople. Just simple truths. Which tree yields the best curve? Which customer lies about coin? How to tell when a fire's too hot by the smell of pine? Tommaso listened, always. One winter evening, as fog crept low through the call and the canal reflected nothing but mist, Lorenzo sat at his bench with his ledger on his lap, the same book he had kept for decades. He turned to the last page. It was nearly full. He stared for a long while, then wrote in slow, steady script, "A barrel is never made to last forever. But it lasts long enough to carry wine, to carry fish, to carry water. It lasts long enough to feed a table, to steady a boat, to teach a boy. And maybe that is enough." He closed the book, blew out the lamp, listened to the sound of the workshop breathing in silence. Lorenzo passed away the following spring. No drama, no pain, just a final breath in a room full of wood and light. The bells of San Giacomo rang slow and deep. The Coopers' Guild carried his body by gondola to the quiet chapel where his father and his father's father had once been remembered. Tommaso did not weep loudly, but he laid the ledger on Lorenzo's coffin with both hands, like an offering. The cover was worn. The pages smelled faintly of oil and oak. Inside was not a record of business. It was a map of a man. Years passed again. Tommaso taught others 2 boys, then a girl with strong fingers and better instincts than all of them. He married a seamstress who embroidered linen stoppers. They raised a child above the shop. The barrels kept turning. The sea kept moving. And the city, that patient, breathing city of stone and water, remembered Lorenzo not with statues or stories, but with the sound of a mallet, with the scent of oiled wood, with the slow turn of a finished cask on a quiet morning. Because in Venice, nothing ever truly ends. It flows, it floats, and it remains. Not in books, but in hands, and in the work those hands leave behind.